We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Most people recognize these words from the Declaration, but what's often lost is the extent to which the beliefs behind these words informed what came after them, namely the American Republic and the oldest and most successful Constitution ever devised. Unalienable, we recognize, is an old world that means non-transferable. To our founders, since rights come from God, governments can neither confer them nor take them away. That's why the central purpose of government is to protect these rights, like the freedom of conscience, religion, speech, and the right to assemble, among other rights. But what about parenting? Is that an unalienable right? Who or what gives the ultimate authority for raising children and imbuing them with a particular worldview and set of values? A lot of people, like this law professor, believe it's the government.
The state needs to be the ultimate guarantor of a child's well-being. There's just no alternative to that. The reason parent-child relationships exist is because the state confers legal parenthood on people through its paternity and maternity laws. It's the state that is empowering parents to do anything with children, to take them home, to have custody, and to make any kind of decisions about that.
Indeed, increasing numbers of people have come to believe that your right to raise your children is subordinate to that of the state, a state whose worldview may be very different from what you hold dear. It's the same thinking that is driving public school and other government officials to indoctrinate our children with things like sex and gender theory, critical race theory, and something called social emotional learning. Together, what we at Protect Our Kids call the triple threat. How far we've come from the vision of our forebears, men like John Adams, who wrote, "Public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private virtue, and public virtue is the only foundation for republics." But change happens gradually before it happens suddenly. The seeds of big societal shifts are planted many decades in advance, where they take root and spread, hidden from sight. Today, we view concepts like virtue as something of a quaint notion, but that was the primary goal of education in America from the mid-17th century up until around the mid-1900s. In the earliest days, all education was privatized, and however foreign it appears to modern Americans, at least for the first 200 years of American history, the primary mediums for education were biblically based. Besides the Bible, books like the Blueback Speller, the New England Primer, and McGuffey's Reader served as education's primary tools. The focus was on what we now call a classical education, the merging of the moral truths from Jerusalem with the logical reasoning of Athens. It was common for students to learn, along with moral lessons, Latin, Greek, logic, and the great classics of Western civilization. But all that changed with these two men. The first was the Unitarian Horace Mann, who came up with the concept of the normal school. Mann had two goals for education. First, to make it uniform, meaning everybody is taught the same thing. And number two, to bring it under government control. The other man was John Dewey, also known as the father of progressive education. Dewey was also a Fabian socialist and signer of the first Humanist Manifesto, which challenged the entire basis of Western civilization and its reliance on ethical monotheism. As for education, Dewey said, it must be regulated to bring about what he called social consciousness and social reconstruction. As for the founder's self-evident truths and creator-derived unalienable rights, well, these are false biases that schools must be protected from. And the public schools certainly have been protected from them. It's been said that politics is downstream from culture, and culture from people's personal beliefs. So the question is, what should we expect when the Judeo-Christian or biblical worldview is no longer believed in by the majority of a nation's citizens, much less venerated? Well, I suppose the answer depends on what's replaced it. It's an important question, Because as Lincoln warned, the philosophy in the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next. But what is the prevailing philosophy governing the majority of American citizens today? And where is it taking us? Well, to find out, maybe we should look at the philosophy being taught in the public schools. Because one thing's for sure, it isn't biblical. It hasn't been for at least a half century. As if to put an exclamation point on it, in 1962, the Supreme Court removed prayer from the public schools. 1 year later, it removed Bible reading. Of course, nature abhors a vacuum, and what immediately stepped in to fill the void was a worldview called materialism, also known as secularism, which rejects moral principles or truths based on any transcendent idea. Morals are merely social constructs, which makes them malleable to the needs of those that they are intended to serve. In time, variations on the secular narrative morphed into a myriad of spin-off worldviews, like modernism, postmodernism, posthumanism, and even post-truth, the idea that emotion and belief should prevail over objective facts. And to these, we must include another materialist-based worldview, if only because of its influence in the nation's public schools today. You've probably heard of it. It's called critical theory, a Marxist-inspired social and political philosophy to overcome the social structures through which people are dominated and oppressed. For critical theorists, Western society is ruled by power structures that need to be dismantled to achieve their vision of social justice and equity, not equality. That's a word from an old and outdated worldview, like the words merit and initiative. In public education, critical theory is the umbrella worldview under which we find most of today's academic pathologies. Critical legal theory, critical race theory, queer theory, white patriarchy, intersectionality, cis heteronormativity, and other orthodoxies that have invaded society and that we know today as wokeism. As to where these ideas came from, well, they didn't come from our founders. The German philosopher Hegel, for example, is perhaps best known for his dialectic. Hegel rejected the founders' idea of self-evident truths as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, along with its unalienable rights. Hegel believed that for social progress to occur, there must be a continual cycle of challenging and then revolting against the status quo. Karl Marx took Hegel's ideas and applied them to the economic struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the haves and the have-nots. But Marx's prediction that the West would inevitably collapse in economic class warfare never materialized. In fact, societies even loosely based on the biblical worldview prosper and expanded beyond Marxist imagining. But these ideas didn't end with Marx and Hegel. Far from it. In the 20th century, men like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and other Marxist thinkers started what's known today as the Frankfurt School in Germany during the Weimar Republic. Originally known as the Institute of Marxism, it was changed to the Institute of Social Research in light of the bad rap that Marxism was getting. In time, it came to be known simply as the Frankfurt School after its city of origin. It was here where the ideology of critical theory first took root. Herbert Marcuse was one of the most powerful and influential voices. But Germans weren't the only ones to sign on. The Italian, Antonio Gramsci, would have a particular powerful influence. Gramsci and others came to believe that if Marxism was ever to take hold in the West, it would not be through what he called a war of movement or actual war and revolution, but through what he called a war of position, by slowly taking over society's major institutions, higher academia, centers of media, commerce, churches, and of course, primary and secondary education. Only then would society be sufficiently conditioned to not only accept a form of centralized control like socialism, they would actually demand it. As Gramsci put it, any country grounded in Judeo-Christian values cannot be overthrown until those roots are cut. Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the New World Order, socialism will triumph, by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. As it happened with the rise of Nazism in Germany, the Frankfurt School socialists began to look for another home. And they found it at Columbia University's Teachers College at the invitation of this man. Yes, our friend John Dewey. What does all this have to do with public education? Well, as I mentioned earlier, change happens gradually, then suddenly. In the ongoing American experiment, the authority for and purpose of education has undergone profound transformation. For over 200 years, the primary authority for education was parents, and the focus was on a child's character development. It wasn't that practical and vocational training were ignored. In fact, far from it. America's schools produce the most productive and educated citizens on the planet. But it was also understood that practical training was secondary to building character, or in Adams' view, public and private virtue. By the 1950s, parents had all but ceded educational authority to the nation's network of public schools. So that by the 1970s, the primary authority for education was now the state, where public officials were becoming more and more resistant to parental influence. And the primary purpose of education was no longer character development, but to instill in children a purely secular worldview, and only secondarily to teach proficiency in the 3 R's. And it didn't take long for the results of this change to manifest themselves. Prior to compulsory public education in 1840, literacy rates were 90% compared to 75% today. According to the Literacy Project, some 45 million Americans are functionally illiterate, unable to read above a 5th grade level, and half of all adults can't read a book at an 8th grade level. In California, the model of progressivism, 1 in 4 of the state's 6 million students are unable to perform basic reading skills. And it's not as if the failures of our public schools have taken us by surprise. In 1983, a now famous report came out entitled A Nation at Risk that warned of a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and a people. But while success in the 3 R's floundered, by one measure, Dewey's goals have been met beyond his imagining. For his University of Chicago professor Alan Bloom declared in his now famous book, The Closing of the American Mind, there is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, that truth is relative. That was nearly 40 years ago. And what's happened since then is a matter of public record. In terms of dollars per student spent, the U.S. outspends virtually every nation on earth on public education. But for all our money, studies like this one from the Pew Foundation puts us in the middle to bottom rungs of academic performance compared to other nations, most of which spend far less than we do per student. In California, arguably the most educationally progressive state in the country, places lower still compared to the sub-average U.S. performance. But much more concerning, in parallel with the declining educational standards, has been the decline in parental rights, starting with Prince v. Massachusetts in 1944, where the court ruled that it is the government that determines what's in the best interest for a child. Or Brown versus Hot, Sexy, and Safer, a case out of the First Circuit, which held that parents have no right to excuse their children from any information made available in school by officials there, including crude, sexually explicit assemblies. And more recently, in a case out of the Ninth Circuit, the court in Fields versus Palmdale School District has determined that there is no freestanding fundamental right of parents to control the upbringing of their children by introducing them to matters of and relating to sex in accordance with their personal and religious values and beliefs. In fact, parents have no constitutional right to prevent the public schools from providing information on that subject to their students in any form or manner they select. After this, the floodgates open to wrest from parents control over their own children. The following are laws passed in progressive California, but other states have passed similarly parent-limiting legislation. For example, in 2011, Assembly Bill 449 passed, allowing schools to pressure minors to have the HPV vaccination without parental consent or notice. A year later, Assembly Bill 1172 outlawed parents seeking professional help to help their children struggling with same-sex attractions. In 2013, the infamous bathroom bill was passed, whereby children were given access to school bathrooms and locker rooms that fit with their perceived gender without parent notice or consent. In 2021 came Assembly Bill 1184, which prevents insurance companies from telling parents about gender-affirming medical care performed on their children without the child's consent. The first they know about it is when the bill shows up in the mail. And last year, California passed Assembly Bill 1955, euphemistically called the Safety Act, whereby public school officials are told to deceive parents about their own children's gender identity. All of which brings us back to the triple threat, because that's what's happened to our schools since A Nation at Risk came out in 1983. A worldview utterly destructive to the original vision of the American Republic, and by extension, Western civilization, has been allowed to infiltrate and corrupt the fragile minds of future generations of Americans. Fueled by sex and gender theory, critical race theory, and social emotional learning, entire generations of Americans are now being corrupted by a worldview incompatible with liberal democracy and the principles of a constitutional republic. But these are topics for future broadcasts. In the meantime, ask yourself, as a culture, is this really the best we can do for our children? And if it isn't, what are we going to do about it? It's something to ponder. For as the great civil rights leader Martin Luther King said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Our children matter. Their futures matter. The truth matters. I'm Mark Schneider for Protect Our Kids.